Good morning, Left Right Radio with Chuck Morse every afternoon at 12 noon live at Facebook. And of course, downloaded to the syndicates at YouTube, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, and the blog sites as well. There's recently been a quote unquote anti-science rally, apparently. A very liberal friend of mine recently made a reference to conservatives as being anti-science. What is this about, really? Well, first of all, besides the obvious, which is an attack, just another thinly veiled attack on faith, as if somehow faith is, untrue and incompatible with science, which is provable. I would argue on that issue that faith and science are two separate disciplines. I mean, one is like apples and oranges, but that one is codependent on the other because both are true. Science deals with the the corporeal world that can be identified and categorized, and we can learn from it and improve human life, and based upon knowledge of studying it, researching it, and looking into all aspects of it. And faith, of course, deals with the mystery of life, the part that ultimately really cannot be really studied because only the Lord God knows. We're not God, we're in the image of God, so we can't be all-knowing and we can't understand the mysteries of the universe. But in a sense, you could say science is the study of God's universe. And yet science, obviously, in and of itself, isolated, is inadequate to explain the mysteries of the universe. Science cannot explain reason or consciousness or emotion or what happens when you open your eyes in the morning, why you can see and what you experience, and being alive and experiencing life. Science can't explain that. Nor should it. Science explains what is categorized and how we can do things like find cures for diseases and build superhighways and create energy and harness the great resources that exist for us to improve human life. I mean, that's, one thing does not cancel the other. Both things coexist. Both things are continuous with each other, and both things are in a sense needed to understand the whole and total picture of the nature of the universe and of the nature of life. But the charge anti-science, right, by people who really have a hatred for religion, they're the ones who have politicized science in many cases. They're the ones who have turned science into a political football. The most obvious example of that is the question of global warming or climate change. They want to make this into a political agenda to thus use it to redistribute wealth around the world, to give wealth to poorer countries by letting them pollute and by penalizing richer countries for being more industrial and more successful. And as usual, they have taken what probably is a legitimate issue, and they have corrupted it with their political agendas. On that question, what I would suggest is that there are scientists on all sides who debate it, but putting that aside, I think that it is prudent public policy, whether or not there's man-made climate change, to simply focus on how to reduce air pollution. Air pollution is the main culprit, according to all theories on climate change, in terms of causing climate change. Carbon monoxide in the atmosphere, CO2 in the atmosphere is what's causing climate change. That is the theory. So fine, rather than scream at each other about whether or not climate change is man-made, let's focus on what we can all agree on, which is reducing air pollution, which is unhealthy for everyone. It's unhealthy for animals. It's unhealthy for humans. It's unhealthy well, it's actually not unhealthy for plants. Apparently, it's actually leading to more of a greening of the planet, particularly apparently in the Sahara, because the carbon creates photosynthesis, which leads to plant growth. But putting that aside, I think we can agree that it should be controlled, and that the answer to it is scientific innovation, the development of new technologies that can reduce air pollution. And we know what some of those already are: wind power, solar power. Those things are all good. Hybrid cars and electric cars, the increase of hydroelectric energy, which is relatively a clean energy. Nuclear, well, that's a more controversial question, and that's something that we could talk about separately. But the point is that there are many innovations that are being worked on, capturing and harnessing the tides. There was an experiment done in the Bay of Fundy in Canada, which is the biggest tidal basin in the world, to harness anything with this movement can be harnessed for energy. I've seen a proposal that would call for turning highways and asphalt into sun-gathering cells, that would then power electric, cables that run along the highways. Brilliant. Why not? The human mind can invent all sorts of things. So I think that if we want to talk about real science or anti-science, instead of politicizing the question, let's focus on what man does best, which is to invent, to create, to imagine, to solve problems. We all agree that air pollution needs to be solved, so let's get to it. And let's develop technologies that would reduce air pollution, and thus we can continue to advance our industrial age without without polluting the air. But the anti-science crowd, of course, on the left, has a history of bad science. It's not anti-science that conservatives are, but they're against bad science, false science, science that has been twisted by political agendas. And of course, historically, one of the great causes of the left, going way back, particularly to the 19th century, is a movement called Eugenics. This was a movement that was patented by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, who actually coined the word eugenics, and who was the father of survey taking, and who believed that man, in order to advance, needed, based on the theory of evolution, they needed to mate with superior species, superior beings, because that's what the theory of evolution is, after all. It's a theory of breeding, and thus create superior people who would then ultimately evolve into a superior species. This is the logical result of the theory of evolution. There's really no way around that. But he was very explicit about it. He was very close collaborator with Darwin. They both lived in London at the same time. I mean, Darwin completely embraced eugenics, particularly in his second book, not the first book as much. The collapse of civilization or something like that. And the idea is that life that is advanced should be promoted and encouraged to breed, and actually paid subsidies or paid emoluments in order to marry right and breed right and have more children. And those who are of lesser evolved species in terms of human beings, they should be discouraged from breeding. I mean, Darwin's very explicit about that. He talks about the Irish as being less evolved. I mean, believe it or not. I mean, it's that things should be done. I mean, they're drawing from Malthus, who is sort of the father of modern population control, and that these eugenic theories very much have remanifested themselves, I would argue, in a very subtle way in today's healthcare national socialization. This is why the left is so hot over Obamacare, because it's a form of neo-eugenics. It is bringing back the idea that a life worth living is the one that healthcare will pay for, and the ones that are not worth living will not get that good a healthcare. Sarah Palin was right when she talked about death panels. That's exactly what this is about. You can read the work of Ezekiel Emanuel, Rahm Emanuel's brother, who was one of the architects of Obamacare, who talks about which person would get the superior health care. And it was based upon their viability, their usefulness to society. If you're too old, you're too sick, you're too young, you're an infant, you may not get the good health care because you're not as much of a use to society. And I mean, the idea goes back to the Greek philosopher Plato, but it's the ultimate dream of the socialistic left. Control who lives and who dies, control who gets benefits and who doesn't, based upon how useful you can be as a human resource to society. Now, there are other false and artificial sciences, bad sciences, that the left has promoted. Recently, you have microaggression theory. This was developed by the Harvard psychologist Charles Pierce in the 1980s, and it's become really almost an institution now on college campuses, and it's being taught to people to assume. And that is that you put someone under a microscope to find racist genes, that there's something racist about them, there's, and that they're not even conscious of their racism. Maybe this is a good thing, and that we now have moved beyond racism so much that to find racism, you have to go under a microscope. But now people's brains are being looked at. I mean, you listen to people on the left talk about anyone that doesn't genuflect in their direction, and you'll hear them say that these people have mental problems, that they might even have physiological problems. Take a look at the work of psychologist Lakoff. What's his name? He's into this big time, and he's quoted heavily. And it gets down to this microaggression theory again, which is that people secretly are racist, or they're secretly whatever the society wants them to be. They're secretly, it depends on what's in and what's out at any given time. And that you'll notice that this is entirely a political agenda. It does not target people who are proper, politically correct, people who are on the left. They don't get the microaggression microscope. Only enemies of socialism get that. And that this is the ultimate manifestation, almost as much as healthcare and eugenics, in terms of controlling people. This is tyranny. I mean, it's like you can't even control who you are. It's all subconscious, in other words. This is, and that you can be penalized for these subconscious tendencies as they are defined by your enemies. This is, which of course gets into the slightly pseudoscientific theory of psychology. Now, I'm not against psychotherapy. I think that psychotherapy and psychoanalysis has a place. And I think psychiatry is the study of the physical brain. And, those things are true, but it's a very young science, and it has been largely politicized. We should note that up until maybe the early to mid 19th century, not only in Europe, but around the world, the main source of therapy was your religious leader, your cleric, your minister, your priest, your rabbi, your imam. You would go to your local priest for counseling. If you're having marital difficulties, if you are having personal problems, you're dealing with real crisis in your life, and you would get counseling. And that counseling included a form of redemption and an understanding that there is such a thing as right and wrong. It was, it was not in a harsh sense, but it was like, look, we're all human beings. We're not gods. We all have our foibles and our faults. And, it's a good thing to see those things and to know that there is a benevolent God that can help you and forgive you for sin and help you improve your life. Psychiatry or psychology under Freud in particular and Carl Jung in the mid to late 19th century, which is a very new science, that replaced the priest, that replaced the cleric with a scientist. It also replaced morality and it replaced redemption with permissiveness, this idea that anything goes. There is not, you're never wrong, you're never doing anything evil. In fact, on the issue of sexuality, Sigmund Freud, who was having an affair with his sister-in-law in the house while his wife was right there and his children, that being Minna something. Minna Bernays, I think her name was. Um, he, um, he developed this concept of polymorphous perversity, which is that anything and everything with him was about sex. He was obsessed with it. And polymorphous perversity was this idea that anything goes. Whatever you do, whatever your impulses are, is good. You can do anything, anytime, with anybody in any situation. There's no, emotion attached to it. There's nothing sacred attached to it. There's no need for relationships or anything else that was a burden to Freud, or any kind of commitment or attachment. That those things are all prejudices. But that just sexuality, whatever feels good, it's very Epicurean, that this is the ultimate virtue. And that to disagree with that, or to be against that, was a form of mental illness, what Sigmund Freud called repression. This was further advanced, or certainly was in a political sense, promoted by none other than Karl Marx, who viewed things like love and commitment and marriage even as artificial constructs, as false constructs. I mean, false consciousness, he called it, created by the bourgeoisie, by these conspirators who set these things up as a way to oppress people. That's why Marx referred to religion as the opiate of the masses. It was something to make people hypnotized, to feel good, so that they could be exploited by this secret cabal of property owners, and that the best way to get rid of it was to get rid of these property owners. And by the way, to get rid of Judaism, which is another subject. And so that's psychology. And again, I'm not against psychology. I'm just pointing out that it's been politicized and that there's a very political element to it. You'll notice that people who are into psychology and psychoanalysis are overwhelmingly liberals, and people on the left who don't have a lot of moral and ethical underpinning, and who are thus emotionally troubled and emotionally, in many cases, broken. Finally, I just want to finish the segment up by touching on the theory of evolution. I've written a book about this. It's available at Amazon. It's an unproven and entirely political theory, and it is the gold standard. It's the very cornerstone of the left-wing experiment. This idea that man is not created in the image of God, but is simply an animal that is evolving into a superior animal. That matches exactly the communist construct and the communist dialectic of societies evolving through stages until it reaches the ultimate stage, that being communism, where all people become one massive ant colony, and all prejudices such as private ownership, property, love, commitment, the rights of trade goods and services, even personal identity itself, it disappears, withers away, as Marx said, and you have this utopian world. That's what the theory of evolution is in a biological sense. There has never been any proof that one species evolves into a superior species, which is the premise of the theory of evolution. And to criticize the theory of evolution is the ultimate heresy. It's beyond the pale for people on the left. They've internalized this to such a degree that they will not tolerate that. So, and my argument simply is, maybe there is evolution, but the fact is it's unproven. There is a political side to it that we need to understand, and that good science is one that is open-minded about any and all possibilities with regard to the origins of the human race and the human species. So, there's good science and there's bad science. Bad science is, I would contend, actually anti-science. Good science is an objective, open-minded view of all of these things, so that we can not only understand the scientific ramifications of what we are studying, but also the political side of it, and how these things have been politicized, used as political footballs. We need to understand who is using them, why they're using them, and how they're being used to deprive us of our freedom and move us into a direction that we may not want to go because it's not in our interest. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching today. My books are available, as mentioned, on Amazon.com. I mean, you could look up my name, Chuck Morse, Morse. My new book, Assassination in America, will be coming out within the next couple of weeks. I am moving toward that. So stay tuned for that. And thanks for watching, everybody.